Hello, everybody. This is Jay Lyde coming at you from League City, Texas. Trendstar Realty. I just wanted to put this quick presentation together to explain to you how we go about buying properties at Trendstar Realty. This is typically given to our listing clients, and some of the verbiage you'll see in the presentation alludes to our 30-day sold guarantee. So like on this first side, you'll see 30 days ago, your listing in review. And that's just because, again, if after 30 days on the market, we will offer to purchase our listings from our clients. But on occasion, we also expand our listing purchase program out to non-Trendstar Realty listings as well. So that's why you're seeing this presentation. So without further ado, let's get going. So typically how everybody starts their listing, they want all cash or a new loan. They want to get paid out of their equity as fast as possible. But, 30 days has passed, or sometimes it's 60 or 90 or 120 days. Everybody's different. But a certain time period has passed and it hasn't sold yet. And so what we want to do is talk about an alternate strategy where we can sell the property fast, but we don't want to expose ourselves to ridiculous, insulting lowball offers that you can sometimes get from iBuyers and investors out there. We don't want to have to rent the house out and become a landlord, take on the second job of being a landlord. And we certainly don't want to have adverse impacts for qualifying for our next home or the financing on our next home. Obviously, when you sell this home, you're not going to go live under a bridge. You're going to buy something else to live in. And so we don't want to have adverse impacts or negative impacts to the qualification process for doing that. We also want to compress the timeline as much as possible, so you don't have to wait very long to get your equity out of the property. So in a nutshell, or sort of an overview here, Trendstar buys houses. We buy properties from our clients and others, but we don't live in the property. Obviously, we don't operate out of the property. We don't keep the properties long term and put tenants in them. We don't want to be landlords either. So we do resell properties to buyers who can benefit from the way we structure the financing. And what we do is we structure non-bank qualifying financing on the property when we purchase, and then we hand that type of financing down to the end occupant. And so it's a win for everybody, both the seller for getting the property sold and the buyers who otherwise might have an issue with going to the bank and getting a loan. But you're watching this because you're mostly interested in your side of the transaction. So we'll focus in on that. And this is my ridiculous attempt at humor. There's a little bit of math coming up, not a big deal. It's not trigonometry or anything, but we did want to take a look at, before we proceed, we want to take a quick look at the renting option. I know a lot of people think about maybe putting a tenant in the property to get that monthly mortgage payment taken care of, and that kind of on the surface may sound like a good idea, but it's important that we objectively sort of analyze that and look at it to see whether or not that's a good option for you. Basic math here. We do a market analysis for rents in the area in your neighborhood to determine what we would expect to get monthly for rent for your property. We subtract your expenditures associated with that, including your current payment and everything associated with that, your principal, your interest, your taxes, your insurance, as well as your HOA dues, because those are not handed down to the tenant either. I mean, rent is dictated by the market, right? The market dictates how much rent you can expect to collect every month. And so we take the payment information, or we take the payment amount and subtract it from the rent. And that's just sort of a basic look at what you should expect to receive from a monthly cash flow standpoint. Now, of course, this does not take into account maintenance. It doesn't take into account management expenses. It doesn't take into account vacancy or any of that. This is just sort of a big, broad, general thing. And those things do matter and they should be accounted for. But this is the broad brush sort of look at analyzing what the cash flow could be expected for any property. It's important to note, though, we should take a minute to talk about the impact of leasing your property out to a tenant that could have on your qualification for your next home mortgage, for your next residence. It's important to know that when you go to qualify, their underwriting guidelines dictate that if you have a tenant in the property, and this is if you already have a lease existing in place, they're only going to give you 75% of the income coming in, or the rent income coming in, towards your DTI, your front and back end DTI, or debt to income ratio calculations. So if you have $1,000 a month coming in on rent, they're only going to give you credit for $750. And that's, of course, if you already have an existing lease in place. And some lenders won't underwrite unless you have anywhere from 12 to 24 months of seasoning on that tenant. So that's important to know. Um, the risk associated with putting a tenant in the property, it's not like you have a 100 unit complex and you have one vacancy and so you're still 99% occupied. With this, if you have a single vacancy on a single family residential property, you're 100% occupied, and that's a scary place to be. I think we could probably agree, generally speaking, across the board, there are exceptions, but who takes care of real property better? Who's going to take care of your house better, an owner or a tenant? I think we probably could universally agree that the vast majority of the time that tenants just are not as incentivized to keep up with the properties. There are some great tenants out there. They do repairs on properties, and they do, they're just a dream to have, but they are the exception, definitely not the rule. So owners take much better care of properties than do tenants, generally speaking. And then of course there's other risk associated with vacancies and screening, getting the right people. Um, Doing all kinds of costs associated with management, repairs, and make readies, etc. Um, However, selling the Trendstar, um, many sellers do consider this option as well, and you're going to see why here as we proceed. Um, we can structure the financing. It says the same cash flow as with renting, but actually we're able to structure the financing back to you in such a way that your effective cash flow is several hundreds of dollars more than what you would expect to receive when renting. And so we do that analysis for you so that you can compare apples to apples. Um, you don't have to take on the second job of being a landlord. So, of course, those vacancy worries and worries about tenant screening and extra wear and tear on the property, all those things that are associated with being a landlord are not things that you have to stress over because you're already basically a lender at this point. You're a bank, and you're not dealing with those sorts of things. And your lender, when you go to qualify for the financing on your next residence, your lender is going to know that as well. They are not only going to not reduce your income uh, based on the fact that you are, because you're no longer responsible for taxes, insurance, HOA, that stuff transfers to the new owner upon closing. So you're no longer worried about that. They're not worried about it either. And they also are not going to apply a vacancy factor, excuse me, to the income that you have coming in on the note. They're going to give you 100% of the income coming in on that note, as opposed to a lease where they would dock you by 25% on that. So, taking a closer look at this, um, again, in a nutshell, these steps are kind of simplified. Obviously, the level of complexity is higher than this when you start getting into the weeds and actually executing. But in a nutshell, this is kind of the steps associated with the process. We put the property under contract. Um, we we set the option period up in that contract. It says 6 to 12 months, but we don't like to go over 6 months, and because by doing so, we would start, we would encroach into that executory contract duration as defined by Texas property statutes. And we want to avoid that for your sake, not necessarily for ours, but it does levy upon you as a seller administrative encumbrances, which we'd like to avoid for you. So actually, we don't like to go over 6 months, but it's a reasonable amount of time for us to market the property. And it's, a very common duration that brokers and realtors would use to list your property anyway. Of course, they're just going to sit you down and say, hey, sign this piece of paper that gives me exclusive right to sell your property. I'm going to put a sign in the yard, a lockbox on the door, put you up on the MLS. That's going to syndicate out to all these different websites, which is great. We do the exact same thing. But just like them, I mean, they're not going to give you a lump sum of cash, and they're not going to pay for your monthly mortgage payment or anything in the process while they're trying to sell it. So that's kind of a similar construct. Once we put the property under contract, we give ourselves that option period to give us plenty of time to go ahead and find the perfect occupant for the property. We don't just put anybody in there. And so it gives us that time to do it. We certainly don't have to use all that time, but it gives us that cushion to be able to find the right person to put in the property, right family to put in the property. And the way the language of the contract is on or before a certain date. So in other words, if it happens beforehand, great. Um, it usually doesn't take that long. So in doing that, we construct temporary seller carry terms back to you as a seller. And it's through that financing vehicle that we're actually able to significantly expand the pool of potential buyers. Of the general population, only about 30% of the people can go down to the bank and get a residential mortgage loan, an institutionally originated loan. The other 70% of people, whether they're slightly credit challenged or they're small business owners that, they don't have like a W-2 wage that lenders are typically going to look for when underwriting these loans. They're small businesses, so what they have to do is they look at their tax returns, and the problem with that is they're writing off all their expenditures and stuff. And when you get to the end of the form, it's like, wow, your net income really isn't that much. Well, we know that it is, but they're taking these deductions from their expense. And these are legal deductions. They're well within their right to do it, but it just, you know, they're making the IRS. They're trying to convince the IRS that they're paupers, but they want to try at the same time to convince lenders that they're princes, and it just doesn't work, right? So this definitely expands the pool of potential buyers for your property. And then what we do is once we find them, we do what's called a simultaneous closing, where Trendstar buys and sells all in the same day. And then from that point, we're working with that occupant to get them refinanced as soon as possible so that you can get cashed out of the property as soon as possible. We estimate we target about 6 to 12 months to do that. So again, focusing on your side of the transaction and represented graphically just slightly differently here. In this example, now obviously these numbers are not going to pertain to maybe your property or every property, obviously, but it's a good example. Sometimes it's helpful to see just numbers and how this would work in general. So what we would do is do a market analysis on the property to determine what the retail value is. In this particular example, that's $300,000. We know on the back end when we're selling to the buyer that we're going to have to pay their agent 3%. And we also account for a 3% margin. Obviously, Trendstar can't do this for free. We don't want to rake anybody over the coals and lowball people, but a 3% margin is very fair. And so we include that and account for that right up front, along with the 3% that's going to the buyer agent on the back end. When we subtract those two numbers out, those two values out, in this particular example, that yields a Trendstar purchase price of $282,000. The next thing we do is we provide a 7% down payment. We do that for three reasons. First, we want to cover all your commissions, which, a typical commission would be a customary commission of 6% to your listing agent. They then, would do their cooperative split with for the buyer side at 3 and 3 on each side. And then that's covered. It comes right out of the down payment, as well as closing costs charged by the title company. So there's 1% left over for that. And generally, that's well and above what's needed. Any balance, of course, associated with that, you put that in your pocket. But we just want to make sure that those expenditures are covered for you. Obviously, tax prorations are going to vary. That's kind of not what we're not including that in here in these numbers here. But if you close in January, you're going to have a very different tax proration than if you close in December for the year. So, but the third reason that we do this is, and actually probably the most important reason, is because that we have enough skin in the game that we're not going anywhere. I mean, if you look at this, we're putting almost $20,000 in this particular example, almost $20,000 down on the property, which is a far cry from like a $3,000 security deposit from a tenant who's going to tie up your house for 12 months on a typical lease. And then there's no light at the end of the tunnel. They're not going to refinance. They're not going to, cash you out of your equity at the end of the lease. It just can be back to business as usual. And again, they tied up your property for 12 months and you let them do it for basically $3,000 security deposit. This is a far cry from that. And what it does is it allows you to have that peace of mind, and you can just relax and know that we can't take a $20,000 bath on your house and continue to stay in business. We're not going anywhere. we're incentivized to stick around, and that's probably the most important reason why we do that. But when you take that 7% down payment, you subtract it from the purchase price, you're left with the balance that's owed back to you as the seller. You'll carry that balance back in the form of what's called a wraparound note or wraparound mortgage in second position. In some states, they're called all-inclusive trust deeds, but and you'll see why here in just a second. Let's just say, obviously, if there's no other encumbrances on the property, this would just be straight seller financing, and this particular financing or these terms would be carried back in first position if there was no underlying lien or mortgage. But in this particular example, as is often the case, there's a first mortgage already in place. And so in this particular example, they bought this property a while ago, and they paid down the mortgage down to $150,000 balance. And the difference between what's owed to the bank and what's owed to you represents your equity. Again, in this case, $112,260. And essentially what happens is that when you carry back that wrap in second position, it just wraps around the first, and you get a big payment from the bigger loan in second position. Out of that comes the payment for the mortgage in first position, and then the balance or cash flow is kept by the seller. Again, in 6 to 12 months, we target refinance of the back end occupant where you get your equity out of the property. Now, if you look over to the left, you'll see kind of how this works from a cash flow standpoint monthly. If you look at that second number down there, that represents the principal and interest portion of the payment going back to the seller on the wrap in second position. Or excuse me, I'm sorry. The second number is the payment going out to the bank on the first mortgage. They originated a while ago at about 225 at 4.5% interest for 30 years or 360 months. That yields a PI payment of $11.40 and 4 cents. That's the second number. When you subtract that from the payment that results from the wrap in second position that the seller carries, you can see that 262, 260 balance, same interest rate, same term, you get 1328.83. You subtract the payment for the first, and the payment from the second, and you see the monthly cash flow there is $188.79. Pretty simple stuff. From time to time, now I will just a quick note here on this. This does not include total effective cash flow because, again, the responsibility for taxes and insurance and HOA and all that stuff gets transferred to the new owner when the title transfers are closing, or to Trendstar. That becomes our responsibility, not yours. And so your effective cash flow is actually several hundreds of dollars more than this, depending upon what your taxes and insurance and all that stuff are. Not the case with leasing. I mean, lease, you still are retaining responsibility for that, but penny saved is a penny earned, and so that has to be, added back into the monthly cash flow to determine the. But this is a, kind of, as I said, a general overview of the financing involved. And but in the event that cash flow just simply isn't enough, it's very rare that it's not. But especially when we account for taxes, insurance, and HOA, we can adjust the term. So you can see here on this bottom example, it's the same note structure, except we've modified the term down to 25 years or 300 months versus 360, which yields a payment of $14.57 and 73 cents. And of course, the difference from the payment on the first yields a higher monthly cash flow. So in summary, the down payment obviously is coming to the seller, the monthly cash flow is coming to the seller, and in an estimated 6 to 12 months, the equity is coming to the seller upon refi of the back end occupant. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. If you remember back to this slide here, what we would normally do is whip out a piece of paper and kind of do these calculations for our clients or for you. Like, let's do it for your house, to determine what your expected cash flow will be. We don't have to do that on paper anymore because we have the calculator, right? So this is just a spreadsheet that we put together to present to you all of the numbers associated with the existing financing on your property and how that compares to the offer that we're going to give you, and how the cash flow that you're going to get, the effective cash flow you're going to get from us, compares to what it would be if you were renting. That's all done here. Again, another poor attempt at humor, but the math is really not that scary. We may have already gone over these numbers with you. We may not. If not, and you want to go over them, just get back in touch with me, and we can we can go through that. Again, here's a summary of again, how this sort of all comes together. I know this is a lot of information. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So I know you're going to have questions. So please feel free to reach out, get in touch with me. And again, if we haven't gone over the numbers for you already prior to you seeing this, we can certainly do that if you're interested. But in any case, I appreciate you watching the video. Again, this is Jay Lyde, Trendstar Realty, out of League City, Texas. Thanks for watching the video. Be in touch soon, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.